11, begin reading in verse 24. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God, rather than to enjoy the pleasure of sin for a short time. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for the examples of the men and women throughout Scripture. We thank you that they teach us of the hope that we can have through faith. And Father, may we also be taught to be reminded by the obstacles that often can stop us, can destroy us, how they were overcome them by putting their trust in you. May we be reminded of the greatest obstacle, the greatest destruction in our way, that of sin, which Jesus took the penalty for. And may what we do now honor him. It's in his name we pray. Amen. It's been a while, but as I got to writing this sermon, I thought of my fictional cousin Gabe. You know my fictional cousin Gabe, who only exists to be able to use old preacher illustrations and make them seem like very relevant. Old preacher Gabe, my old preacher illustration story, fake cousin Gabe. He's been an entrepreneur his entire life. When he was 15, he decided he would sell encyclopedias door to door. Now, he did not go to work for Britannica. Instead, what he did is he pulled the Britannicas off his family shelf, put them in his wagon, and decided to knock on the first door he came to. My fictional aunt looked at him and said, "Son, we're not going to buy back our own encyclopedias. We don't even need encyclopedias anymore." You know, he's always looking for those kind of things. I wouldn't say he's not been a success, but in a conversation that obviously I did not have with my mother, she was telling me about his latest venture. He entered an ad at the local zoo that just said, "Need a job, come to the zoo." So he showed up at the zoo, and the zookeeper handed him a monkey costume, a gorilla costume, and said, "Look, here's the deal. Our gorilla is out sick. Can you play a gorilla?" Said, we've got school kids coming in. It's the fall. It's that time of year where they're going to come to the zoo right before we close. We'll get a new gorilla in the spring, but we need to know, can you be a gorilla for the next few weeks? You know, climb the trees, grab the bananas, do a couple of flips if you want. You know, just be a gorilla. And Gabe said, "Well, I've never been a gorilla before, but I'll give it a try." So earlier this week, school trip came through. Gabe is in his gorilla costume. He climbs a tree. He does a backflip in the tree. The kids are amazed. They start clapping. Well, Gabe got a little excited about himself. So he climbed higher in the tree, and he flipped again, except he missed the branch. And he landed in the cage next door. That's a small zoo. You'd think that you wouldn't put the lions next to the gorillas, but they did. Gabe falls in the lion den and starts screaming, "Help me, help me, help me!" Sealing his fate at the job. But luckily for him, the lion walked over and said, "If you don't be quiet, we're going to lose both our jobs." She informed me that he also, he's already got another venture lined up. Don't worry about him. He's going to buy some franchises in shaved ice companies. But they're only going to open in the Arctic Circle because the ice is cheaper there. So, you know, as we talk about fears, and we get to number 2, our fear of failure, clearly fictional cousin Gabe seems to have been able to overcome the ability to venture out and attempt and try and sometimes not succeed. And you go, did you say we're talking about the fear of failure? Did you read Hebrews chapter 11? Because I'm a little confused what this text has to do with failure. Yeah. Except when I read Hebrews chapter 11, there's that part of me that had to sit through Exodus class with Dan Dyke back at seminary that goes, the writer of Hebrews really picks an interesting way to tell this story. He's very selective in what he decides to share. And sometimes what's not said can be as beneficial as what's said. We've got the concept that Moses makes a decision. But the problem is, there's kind of a skip of 40 years. The reality is, the story isn't nice and concise as it is in Hebrews when you read it in Exodus. The truth is, for 40 years, before there's an Exodus, there's an exile for Moses. Because Moses became a failure as the leader of Egypt by a choice that he made. And some of us will have failures that are a result of our own choices. Sometimes the reason that we did not succeed is because, well, we threw Britannicas in a wagon and tried to sell them back to their very owners. We make decisions that really you can see in hindsight, and sometimes you can see in foresight, this is not a very good decision. What the writer of Hebrews does not tell us is what exactly happens between he chose not to be Pharaoh's grandson anymore and what it meant to then leave Egypt. See, here's how it happened. At about age 40 or so, Moses decided that he had had enough of being the adopted kid. It was time to find his roots. When he realized the story of him being dipped out of the water and that he was a Hebrew child, he went out one day, and the writer of Exodus, Moses himself, tells us what happened. One day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people, glancing this way and that and seeing no one. He killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Now wait a minute, hold on. The grand leader of the Israelites, if he makes himself the leader by his own actions, has now killed a man in cold blood. You got that? To say I looked this way and looked that way is like, I want to make sure nobody's watching. This is a premeditated act. This is a decision and determination to take the life of someone else. And then it gets worse. On the next day, he went and saw two Hebrews fighting amongst themselves. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" And we find out that he didn't even do a very good job looking this way and that, because the man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, what I did must have become known. And then Pharaoh finds out, and now your murderer becomes a fugitive, and he heads out into the desert, where he gets married, hangs out for 40 years. See, that kind of part's missing in Hebrews. We took the failure part out of the story. You ever lived in the desert because of the decisions you've made? You ever allowed failure to lead you to run? You ever hid out because of the choices you made, thinking there's never another hope? You ever moved to the Arctic because it didn't work out when you tried to be a gorilla? Sometimes we're going to make decisions and choices, and they're not going to succeed. Now, I'm not saying that this text justifies your decision to kill someone, all right? In fact, I'm going to remind you that the one who killed someone in Exodus 2 is the same one who was told to record in Exodus 22, 20, "Thou shalt not kill," all right? But the truth is, just like last week when we talked about the concept of rejection being a reality in life, failure is also a reality in life. And you need to say that to some people, because some of us, or some of you, or some of us and some of you, may have been raised with the concept that failure is worse than anything. So instead of failing, you just don't even give it a try. Because there's nothing worse that can happen than to bring some sort of shame to the family name because you did not succeed. You don't want to be the fictional deadbeat of the family. You don't want people telling those stories about you. So you make no choices at all. We end up with paralysis because of the fear of failure. But failure is a reality. The psalmist writes this, "My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever." Psalm 73. "Those who are far from you, God will perish. You destroy all those who are unfaithful to you. But I can be faithful and fail. I can make risk and be bold and do things, and it may not work out the way we thought it would. I've made the sovereign Lord my refuge. I will tell of all of your deeds." But you know what makes life hard when it comes to the reality that failure is a true part of the Christian life? We don't have a whole lot of conferences where Christians gather together to talk about all the mistakes they've made. Nobody goes to a business seminar on how to mess up royally. Let me tell you about the 19 mistakes we made before we hit on the 20th idea and it was right. And oftentimes, when we fail, whether it's by choice or by culture, sometimes the church is the last place people want to go when they failed. It's the last place they want to be. Like Moses is like, you know what? I think what I've done has been going to precede me. And then we go to the land of the desert. It's not Bible, it's British. Let me give you another quote to help you with the concept of when our choices fail. In Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis writes this, "You know what happens when you fail? You must ask for God's help. Even when you have done so, it may seem to you for a long time that no help or less help than you need is being given. Never mind. After each failure, ask forgiveness, pick yourself up, and try again. Very often what God first helps us towards is not the virtue itself, but the power of trying again." Let me ask you this. In your family, is there a cultural principle that failure is okay if you're trying to do what's right? Is there the chance that you can take a risk, and when you don't sell the encyclopedias, we're going to cheer you on when you put on the gorilla suit? We're not going to give you any money when you decide to open the ice station in Antarctica, but if you want to go, God bless you. Be the North Pole, by the way. That's Arctic Circle. I made a failure right there with that illustration. Let me ask this question. In church, in your history of being the church, is the church a place where failure is part of its culture? You know what I've learned in ministry? You know what often comes about in failure? The blame game. Why didn't that work? Whose fault is it? Instead of, we took a risk. And with blame comes shame. We'll talk about shame in a couple of weeks. But Moses' first failure comes in between those two verses when he makes a decision, a bad decision on his case. But it's a decision that's a risky decision. It's a decision that does fulfill what the writer says about faith. No longer do I want to be Pharaoh's son and reject my heritage. I want to be the leader who realizes that God has a special plan with his people, and I'm going to try to lead them out. He's just 40 years too early, and his tactics really are wrong. And because the people are still in bondage, chapter 3 picks up in Exodus and says that God remembers. And God calls Moses back. And now is the nice, wonderful part that we see every year around Easter, where Charlton Heston shows us what it means to go and deal with Pharaoh and those 10 plagues that precede those 10 commandments, right? If you put yourself in Moses' place, though, can you imagine what life like this is like? First of all, you bargained with God when he set a bush on fire and talked out of it, and the bush never got consumed. And the voice told you, hey, remember 40 years ago when you tried to be the leader? Now you're the leader. And Moses said, I killed a guy. I don't talk so good. Are you sure I'm your guy? And God sends him back, and now Moses is going to have to figure out how to succeed around his circumstances. Sometimes our failures are not our choice. They're the results of the circumstances in which we live. Sometimes, believe it or not, the deck is stacked somewhat against you. Moses, on the bright side, knows that he's walking somewhat into a casino with a stacked deck. Exodus chapter 7. Here's what God says when he sends him there. Then the Lord said to Moses, see, I have made you like myself to Pharaoh. That's pretty cool. All right. I am like the divine. And then God says, let me tell you how that works with human beings and the circumstances that comes about. And I'm going to make Aaron basically you as you are to me. He will be your mouthpiece. He'll be your prophet. You guys are going to say everything I command you. And your brother Aaron is going to tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go out of his country. And then because you're God, that's going to happen, right? Well, not exactly. Because I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart. And though I multiply my miraculous signs and wonders in Egypt, he will not listen to you. Then I will lay my hands on Egypt with a mighty act of judgment. I'll bring out my divisions and my people, the Israelites. And the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring the Israelites out of it. Hey, Moses, welcome to an Old Testament pattern, my friend. You're not going to succeed very well. Good luck. Now go. Don't worry, Moses. Jeremiah is going to need to read this story when I come to him and tell him to prepare the people for what's going to happen for 70 years in Babylon, and they decide not to listen to a single word he's saying. Don't worry, Moses. All the other prophets are going to have to listen when I tell them to go to their very own people, and their very own people do the same thing where they make their hearts hard. You know what the interesting thing about the story to me is? Moses keeps going back every time God tells him to go back. And it would be simple for you and I because we've seen the Charlton Heston movie. We know how many plagues there are. How many plagues does Moses know there are going to be in chapter 7? I'll multiply my power. You got a number for me there, Lord? No? Okay. Frogs didn't do it. Gnats didn't do it. The river turned to blood. That didn't do it. What more do I need to do? And what makes it worse is Moses doesn't know at the time what he knows and is revealed to him in Sinai when he's writing Exodus. You read through those plagues and you keep coming across this phrase, and Pharaoh hardened his heart. And then God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And then Pharaoh hardens his own heart. And God finally just says, I'm done with Pharaoh. I'm going to harden his heart. Moses doesn't know all this, but he keeps going in. Week after week after week. The great deliverer. And you know what? There's no delivery. Until we finally get to this promised plague. When Moses finally said, all right, this is it. Can you imagine that for a second? How much rejection does it take for you before you go, all right, I'm done. I'm throwing my hands up. I'm moving on. Y'all you Israelites find your own way out. The promised land is east. All right? I'm going to go ahead and head there myself. If you all can figure out a way to get there, I'll be waiting for you. And there's a kid named Gabe who just relocated here from the Arctic. He's selling shaved ice. You're going to be excited about this. See, my fictional cousin now travels through time. Anyway. Sometimes the circumstances of life just make what we plan to do and set out to do not work the way we planned for them to work out. That's the downside of living in a universe in which created people have free will. I know you and I want to be and want that promise that Moses received. You will be like me. You will be God in this universe. Yes. Except the reality is because of our free will, we have the ability to treat God the same way that Pharaoh treated Moses. We have that ability and desire to control all relationships so that success is always possible. And sometimes it doesn't work out that way. The question is, when life is not working out that way, do you continue or do you say enough is enough? Well, we quoted one British author. Let's quote another one. In her address to Harvard, the woman who was living with her daughter in her car and decided to write a book of multiple pages, hundreds of pages. And she sent it, of all places, to Scholastic Publishing. Anybody know what Scholastic Publishing is? Anybody remember what Scholastic Publishing is? Those are those like 18-page books with stickers in them that you try to get kids in elementary school to pay way too much for. Those are the books that show up at the book fair where you pay $914 for a 27-page book about the heroes and villains of wrestling in full color. Now they're in full color. Back in my day, they were still black and white. Yes, I did own both Heroes and Villains of Wrestling 1 and Heroes and Villains of Wrestling 2. Also, you should know that I did Heroes of Wrestling 2 as a 7th grade book report, dressed up as the late Randy Savage. That is very impressive. Yeah. Oh, yeah. But J.K. Rowling sends the novel for Harry Potter to this company, making both herself and Scholastic two of the most successful stories of the last 25 years. When addressing Harvard graduates on the concept of what it means to live in a world where circumstances may lead to failure, she said this: "It is impossible to live without failing at something. Unless you live so cautiously that you might as well not have lived at all. In which case, you failed by default. Failure gave me an inner security that I had never attained by passing exams. Failure taught me things about myself that I could have learned in no other way. I discovered that I had a strong will. I had more discipline than I had suspected. I also found out that I had friends whose value was truly above the price of rubies. The knowledge that you have emerged wiser and stronger from setbacks mean that you are ever after secure in your ability to survive. You will never truly know yourself or the strength of your relationships until both have been tested by adversity. Such knowledge is a true gift, for all that is painfully won, and it has been worth more than any qualifications I have ever earned." C.S. Lewis stated that much more succinctly. He said that failure are the finger posts on the journey, on our ultimate journey. I assume that's like a fence post, because I'm not British. Moses is going to live through more circumstances and choices after the Exodus. He does lead the people out. You know the stories that are contained in Deuteronomy and Numbers and Deuteronomy, where while leading the people out, they start to rebel, and God says, "Hey Moses, I'll make you a deal. Let's wipe them all off the planet and start all over again." And Moses says, No, that's ultimate failure, because you have made the promise that the descendants of Abraham are going to come out. If I only bring the people out for you to destroy them, people around here are going to go, what kind of schizophrenic God is it that Moses was listening to? Then Moses later thinks to himself in Numbers, maybe I should have let God wipe them out. When he finally gets so frustrated that he forfeits his own ability to go into the kingdom or into Canaan. But there's that moment in Deuteronomy when God lets him see the promised land prior to his death. And the successes that he had achieved allow him to be recorded in this chapter 11 of Hebrews. And they also become what's necessary to pass the baton on to one of the two faithful spies who led Israel successfully in that desert time. One of the two guys who told the people, quit rebelling, quit being doofuses, quit failing because of your own choices. Oh, you look at the circumstances of the promised land, and these other 10 guys have tried to convince you that the circumstances are so much that we're just not going to go. Or in the words of J.K. Rowling, by default, we're going to fail. His name's Joshua. He gets to live beyond the death of the 40-year generation that passes away. He gets to become the leader of that next generation. And before they can start to tell the stories of their parents and how it didn't happen and start talking about going back to Egypt one more time, God comes to him and tells us what failure takes away and what faith allows us to have. Joshua chapter 1 verse 6. Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their fathers to give them. Be strong and be very courageous. Do not turn from the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Do not let the book of the law depart from your mouth. Meditate on it day and night, so that you will be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be terrified. Do not be discouraged. For the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Guess what failure takes away? Since I mentioned and made us stop and read it together 3 times, and the opposite of it once. Failure takes away courage. Courage can face failure looking for success. When we give up, say, I'm done, there is no hope, we've become discouraged. We become a cowardly lion. Remember him? I mean, he could be king of the forest. He could be a duke, an earl, and a prince. If he wasn't afraid of a dog from Kansas that came in on a tornado. He's discouraged. And what success doesn't help us find, but what sometimes the struggles and the traverse of failure allow us to find, is courage. It's where we find that discipline that we have, that resolve that we have. When we find out who can truly be trusted and who is only our friend when the times are good. And maybe you have lost your courage. Maybe you have allowed yourself to be limited by or defined by your failure. But let me encourage you of something that comes out of all of chapter 11 of Hebrews. And understand this: failure does not have to be final. You know why I had to reinsert parts of Moses' story into Hebrews chapter 11? Because the writer overlooked them. Read that again with me, how he describes Moses. Moses, when he grew up, said enough of Pharaoh's house. He chose the suffering that comes along with being part of God's people. He led God's people out, though even if Pharaoh tried to stop it. He kept the tradition of the Passover. Those are successes. You read through chapter 11, and you see people who have failures that could be what defined them. Abram and Sarai, culturally failures in their culture with the inability to conceive a child. And the writer says, no. These were courageous, faithful people. That Abraham, even when it was beyond the kind of time when men still seemed to be potent, and his wife, who was long past childbirth, they did the amazing and gave birth to a son. I know. When we talk about the graciousness of God and forgiveness, I want to point out all those moments of but. I want to remind us that we need to go back to C.S. Lewis and talk about confessing when we failed. But the reality is, the writer of Hebrews says, quit talking about the failures. In chapter 11, God is cheering on our success. Man, he puts Jephthah in this passage of successful people. Remember Jephthah? He's the guy that when we talked about mountains last summer, we had to do some wrangling around and try to figure out how not to make him kill his own daughter by sacrifice because he made a promise to kill the first thing that came out of his house. And we realized and came to the conclusion we can't wrangle around it because that's exactly what the historical event was. Talk about failure. Talk about something that can easily define you. And the writer here goes, you know what defines him? He's defined by his faith. He's not defined by that one moment in the journey. He's defined by the entire steps. And we talk about the concept of being defined by the journey, not the steps. One more British author. This time from The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Rings. J.R.R. Tolkien writes this: faithless is he that says farewell when the road darkens. Faithful is he who continues despite the moments of darkness, the moments of failure, and can find success. I almost didn't use Hebrews 11. There was one other option, but it was going to require too much of a comparison and contrast sermon between two different people. Because one of them his entire life has been defined by his failure, despite the fact he did it only once, and another member of his party did it 3 times. We could have looked at the comparison of on the night in which Jesus was betrayed. We could have looked at Judas, who after the betrayal finds out that his failure did not make Jesus king. In fact, it leads to his crucifixion. And when he tries to absolve himself of his sin, the people in the temple show him that circumstances have changed. And they go, well, that's your fault, buddy, not ours. And Judas decides that for him, failure is final. He takes his own life. And then we find out, reading the accounts of the gospel afterwards, that it becomes his definition. Because every time we come across the name Judas Iscariot, we're told, the one who would betray Jesus. Except he's not the one who betrayed Jesus. He's one of the 12 who betrayed Jesus. They all ran. And the 2 who didn't fully run, John and Peter, who come outside the temple court while the trial's going on. Oh, it wasn't for money. There wasn't even any sort of motivation, like a prize for Peter to do it. Peter does it just completely out of lack of courage. Because he betrays Jesus. He betrays Jesus to a servant girl who in that culture has absolutely no ability to do a thing to Peter, even if he confessed the most vile of things, which possibly being a follower of Jesus could be considered on a night in which he's going to be betrayed. But in the 40 days between the resurrection and the ascension, the promise that continuing on the journey, there's the possibility of listening to what C.S. Lewis says, that when we confess, there's restoration. The ability to learn from and grow from what we have done. and the ability to stick even when the things get dark, or the lessons he'll learn. Because what Jesus had promised in Luke chapter 22, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift you as wheat, but I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. But when it does, and when you have turned back, you will strengthen your brothers. The one who betrayed Jesus 3 times has that wonderful beachside moment with Jesus where he's allowed to confess him again 3 times. And like the people in Hebrews 11, we don't talk about Peter the betrayer. We talk about Peter, the apostle who spoke on the first day of Pentecost. We talk about St. Peter, who has a basilica named after him in Rome. We talk about Peter, who gets an entire town named after him in Russia until Lenin takes it over. And then we get it back after the fall of communism. We talk about Peter, one of the 12. We talk about Peter, the writer who encourages the church to remain faithful in 1st and 2nd Peter. Because failure does not have to be final. The journey continues. The writer of Hebrews writes, so that those who are thinking about leaving the journey because it's getting difficult will continue and remain. The encouragement of overcoming our fear of failure is the reality that, again, we worship a God who loves to brag about our successes. Maybe today you need to take in and put into practice what C.S. Lewis spoke of, that the failures you've made in life are the realization that you're separated from a journey with God. Maybe you need to confess that and begin that journey. Or maybe your attitude towards people's lack of success requires us to be those friends who become more valuable than rubies. Or maybe today is a day where you were thinking about just giving up. Looks like the sun's setting, the journey's going to get difficult. Let me encourage you to continue. Let me encourage you to find a fellowship that encourages you to continue. If you need to make the first decision publicly, we're going to offer you an invitation as our worship team comes to sing our song of invitation. If you need to make one of those other 2 invitations, maybe where you're at, maybe you should share with God the prayer of your heart. Maybe you've thought about just throwing in the towel. Ask that God would allow you to receive once again encouragement instead of discouragement. Let's stand for our invitation this morning.